Welcome. Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to the Expert Roundtable at TRT World Forum on the contours of Russia's grand strategy, with special attention to the cases of Ukraine and Georgia. We have 4 distinguished speakers and 5 discussants in this panel, and we will go in the order that they are listed in the program. My name is Şener Aktürk. I'm an associate professor of international relations at Koç University and a senior fellow at TRT World Research Center. We are going to, just for logistical purposes, let me mention that we are going to have a first round of speakers between 5 and 8 minutes. And the way I will signal that you have only 1 minute left would be by raising my hand. You can see the raise hand function. For example, I'm doing it right now. Then we recommend that you complete the first round of your talk in about 8 minutes. And then we'll turn to the 5 discussants. Again, the recommended time frame is up to 5 minutes. And in the last minute, I'll raise my hand. And then we'll turn to the second round of responses and reactions and comments, which the recommended time frame is between 2 and 3 minutes. Again, in the last minute, I'll raise my hand. So without further ado, I will turn to our first speaker, Ms. Iuliia Mendel, the first spokesperson to the President of Ukraine. The floor is yours, Ms. Mendel.
Many thanks for this. First of all, let me say that I'm honored to speak at the TRT World Forum, especially focusing on such an important topic for me personally and for my country as grasping of contours of Russia's grand strategy. So I want everyone else to be frank, because frankness is a value today, that the world is facing huge geopolitical transformations and shocks, and instability is the only stability that we've got today. The issue is that usual rules and government instruments have become too outdated today, no matter which country we are talking about. That's why the Black Swans from eponymous Nassim Nicholas Taleb's bestseller more and more influence the world affairs, showing global leaders' inability for concrete predictions. Black Swans, let me remind you, the unexpected incidents that strongly influence the course of events and which in most cases are ignored by experts because they seem to be highly improbable or even impossible. Like 9/11, the Second World War, and coronavirus pandemic are the Black Swans. Instability and unpredictability make people vulnerable around the globe. And in this context, I find Russia a good player to turn instability and unpredictability in its instruments of winning geopolitical games. Russia is good today in so many ways that it scares more and more, especially when we talk about countries of post-Soviet space as Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and all others, including the poor people of Belarus facing the risk of becoming, if not one of the Russia's federal regions, then at least its vassal state. Ukraine has 1,200 miles of border with Russia. If Belarus loses its independence, the border of risk will be another 700 miles. Now we have Russia flexing its military muscles called military exercise at the eastern border of Ukraine, placing missiles in occupied Crimea, which is in the south of Ukraine. And soon we can have Russia's power on the northern border of the country. I will remind you that Russia has started military conflict in Ukraine, which people here in Ukraine call simply the war. And nearly 14,000 people were killed in this war. Millions lost their homes and turned into internally displaced people. PTSD of soldiers and civilians is the challenge for our future generations. And this is the war at only 3% of the territory of Ukraine. Should we be afraid of Russia's appetites in the nearest future is the rhetorical question. Russia is good. Russia never gives up. Its instruments of propaganda in Goebbels style, disinformation around the world, manipulations in negotiations are primitive, but it does not mean that they are weak. They work better than outdated Western state models that cannot support as many masses of people as they used to. Is not Afghanistan the most recent example to this? In early August, both the European Union and the USA believed that Taliban would need a month to enter Kabul. It took them a week. We were wrong in our calculations. The West explained the failure of millions of lives and investment of $83 billion. Russia is good at achieving its goals. It enters the countries, occupies territories, starts military conflicts, filling the regions of post-Soviet space with its mercenaries. And there are no instruments to resist this. Russia has made the conflict in Moldova nearly 30 years ago, and it's still there, the gray zone in the middle of Europe that Moscow uses to blackmail Chisinau for gas consummation and eternal gas debts. Russia has occupied Abkhazia around 30 years ago and South Ossetia 13 years ago, and now turned these territories into tourist destinations for its citizens and film locations for its movies. So easy, right? You just come and take what is someone else's. Russia has occupied the part of Ukraine, Donbass, 7.5 years ago, and we still call it a temporary occupation. Is not Russia good in taking what it wants? Russia is good even in economic moves. Is not Nord Stream 2 a good example for this? Gas shortages in the European Union led to prices records and panic after Gazprom has not provided enough gas in European hubs. And absolutely, let's say unpredictably, Russia demonstrates itself a hero to kindly suggest its support after Nord Stream 2 starts operating, reducing prices to $700. $700. Let me remind you that Belarus gets 128. Meanwhile, Russia is trying to support those countries where its partners share its agenda. Hungary is getting direct supplies of natural gas at cheaper prices. Negotiations with Serbia are more difficult, but Russia's insistence is always impressive. Russia is good in many things, which is so bad for the world. It does not matter how we will legally name every occupation. If the global community is concerned about Moscow's actions, how many sanctions Russia will survive, or if we just have not found other ways than those controversial to somehow agree for Russia's office. In any of these combinations, Russia is expanding. No mask can help in case of Russian virus. Russia understands only power, and it doesn't see any other power bold, powerful, and uncompromising enough to stop it. Perhaps except China and Turkey, I guess. The USA is still a global leader, seems to be too far and more deep in its own domestic problems, in many ways caused by Russia's attempts to meddle the Western politics and outdated Western state instruments. Besides, Moscow has successfully developed the narrative of rotten West, not kidding, it's the quote, based on a deep and constant hatred to the USA. All of this is something we are afraid to say publicly, though these things are well clear for Western leaders. And I'm not the one to accuse or judge. I'm just a voice of someone begging for the world to wake up after such a long sleep. There's to respect the black swans enough to predict them and to stop the world living a turkey life when the bird feels comfortable being fed every day, having no clue it's fed for being eaten. Today, Russia might be one of the worst global black swans, but we are not Turkish to believe its corn is safe. The world leaders must understand this. We need to start changes on multiple levels. First, and the most important, is to rethink our approaches to education, to make it as accessible to as many people as possible, including digital literacy. We need to change the ways of analysis, trying to look more broadly and comprehensively at the causes of events and ways of development. And most likely, we should stop asserting long-term scenarios, but instead offer an in-depth analysis of current conditions, suggesting multiple angles. Bureaucracy should become applied and work for the people and for the states from country to country. We have seen how complex bureaucratic models make many solutions or help to ordinary citizens impossible, while failing to solve problems that depend on the human factor. We must unite in face of global challenges and focus on global cooperation, while countries are increasingly focusing on domestic problems. Global narratives are dynamically transforming, and our approaches and policies must transform too, to fit the expectations, hopes, and values of the people around the world. Thank you for the floor, and I'm happy to discuss further.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Mendel, for your speech and also for keeping to the time limit. Thank you very much. Now we turn to Mr. Andrey Kortunov, Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. The floor is yours, Mr. Kortunov.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think that I have a small problem with the title of our panel. I'm not sure that we can talk about a Russian grand strategy today. First and foremost, because the Russian political agenda is clearly shifting in the direction of domestic problems that the country encounters. If you look at the Russian opinion polls, you'll see that most of them reflect that the Russian public and the Russian voters in particular are much more concerned about pending social and economic problems at home rather than about real or imaginary success stories in the Russian foreign policy. And I think this trend was accelerated during the COVID pandemic, which further shifted the Russian attention away from the big international agenda to nuts and bolts of issues like public health, social security, retirement age, education, and the rest. So if this is true, and sociology suggests that this is true, I think it will imply certain changes in the Russian foreign policy. Probably we'll see some of them already in place. I think that the Russian foreign policy is likely to be more reactive rather than proactive in years to come. It is likely to be more opportunistic than visionary, and it is likely to be more tactical and situational rather than strategic. So Russia will react to impulses which it perceives mostly as potential challenges and threats rather than opportunities and new openings. What does it mean in terms of Russia's relations with its neighbors, especially relations where Russia has serious problems like Ukraine and Georgia? I think that the current moods in Moscow, and at least this is my understanding of the current moods in the Russian political establishment, is that there is not much that Russia can do to change the situation in relations with either Kiev or Tbilisi. So the best option for Moscow is status quo maintenance, avoiding escalation and too high risks associated with such an escalation, because Moscow has little to gain but a lot to lose if such an escalation takes place. That includes not just further deterioration of relations with the two countries in question, but also potentially very unfortunate and very detrimental developments in relations between Russia and its Western partners. And if you look at the Russian posture over the last year or two, I would venture to say that it was rather moderate compared to some expectations. Many expected that Russia would jump at the opportunity to absorb Belarus. It didn't happen. Many thought that Russia would interfere directly in the political processes in Moldova. I think that Russia took a rather detached approach to political change in Chisinau. Many thought that Russia would immediately interfere in the South Caucasus. I think that this interference was delayed in time, and Russia allowed Turkey to play a very important role during the last escalation of the Caucasian crisis. Russia essentially ignored the coup d'etat in Kyrgyzstan, or the revolution in Kyrgyzstan, no matter how you name it. It does mean that Russia will take passive approach to many international issues, but I think that it will calculate very carefully the risks associated with its activism and the benefits that it can get out of its activism. So, for example, if we get to issues of Middle East and North Africa, moving away from the post-Soviet territory, I would say that if Russia were to engage itself in some of these places, it is likely to be a Libyan model rather than the Syrian model, with very limited commitments and with geoeconomics overshadowing geopolitics. It's exactly what we see in Libya today, and I think that we might see it in some other African countries further along the way. Whether this is something that can create additional problems for the West or for the international community, it's up to you, for you to judge about that. But I do not expect too many surprises to come from Moscow anytime soon. At the same time, and this is something that I'm going to conclude my small presentation with, at the same time, we should not forget that there is a deep conviction in the Russian establishment that the West and the United States in particular is a descending international player, not an ascending one, and that the decline of the West is irreversible. The balance of powers is not on the Western side, so Russia does not feel that it has to make concessions or adjustments to meet the Western demands right now, if indeed the West is declining. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kortunov. And now we turn to our third speaker, Mr. Pavel Baev, who is a research professor at Peace Research Institute and senior non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute. The floor is yours, Mr. Baev.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to partake in this conversation. And like Andrey, I was a little bit surprised when I was given the theme, not about Russian grand strategy, I was surprised, but about the two cases. I said, why these two cases? And now I certainly know it was perfect timing. You time it exactly to the visit of US Secretary of Defense to Georgia and Ukraine, which made a lot of impression on the Russian media. The trip had a lot of commentary. And this commentary only brings me my first observation, how little these two cases are really seriously discussed in Russian political debates. While DAI conference is happening today, Dmitry is there, I don't think these two cases will be taken there. Last week, it was a big forum in Moscow. Gimo was organizing it, and Iuliia Nikitina was certainly there, and Andrey was speaking there. A lot of interesting discussions on Afghanistan, on transatlantic relations, on strategic stability. Very little on Ukraine, even less on Georgia. These two cases are of huge importance for Russian policy making, particularly the Ukrainian, certainly. The very scale of it, it's the impact of the Ukrainian case on Russian policy in the world is colossal, and discussion is so limited. I can probably compliment Andrey Kortunov. He's only a rare case. His last article on comparing Russia-Ukraine relations with India, Pakistan is very interesting. I'm glad to disagree, but at least there is something there to, to read and to scratch my head about, unlike many other debates. And I think the reason is that in Russian political debates on Ukraine, yes, it is possible to discuss the domestic developments in Ukraine, and of course, these developments are quite exciting. Very easy to comment on them, but as far as Russian policy making, I think the Russian analysts are very limited, and they feel obliged to really follow party political line. It's impossible for them to spell such words as aggression, annexation, and the party political line is drawn so hard and so firm that any deviation becomes extremely risky. And last week we saw how this line was drawn even harsher and even lower with the publication of an article in Kommersant signed by Dmitry Medvedev. You know, quite remarkable article, I have to say, and next to no discussion, neither in Kommersant nor in mainstream media, about what it really means. And there is an important lie in this article. And typically you try to wrap your lie in several half-truths and several things which add credibility to the lie. And in this case, the lie was wrapped in a lot of rude argument about Ukrainian leadership, with whom it's impossible to do have any meetings, to do any business. Really very rude. But the lie was more than that. The lie was that Russia doesn't need to do anything about Ukraine. It can just sit and wait until a more reasonable leadership would come. And it's not the case at all. Russia is not waiting. Russia is doing a lot on the Ukrainian direction. Earlier this year, it put a lot of military pressure on Ukraine. Presently, what Russia is doing is in a different domain. It's much more in the domain of energy policy. Russia is using the current energy crisis in Europe very skillfully in order to discontinue, first to reduce and then to eliminate altogether the energy transit through Ukraine. There are new pipelines, and Russia is pushing very hard for fast certification of Nord Stream 2, after which already next year it will tell Europe, after that crisis, you know, you need Russian gas, and we're ready to supply. But we don't want to supply through Ukraine. There are other channels. We don't need to go through Ukraine, and you don't really want complications related to that. Let's stop it. And that would terminate, would cut a very important connection between Ukraine and Europe, certainly. That would put Ukraine in a very precarious position. And I think after that, Russia would be ready for a new round of military pressure, because this round is perceived in Moscow as quite successful. What resulted from this attempt at military pressure was the summit with President Biden and new talks with the US leadership on strategic stability, which Russia wanted very much. And it is seen as a result of this experiment with applying military pressure. I'm pretty sure it will be repeated in the near term, and it's plain impossible to discuss it in Moscow. Georgian case. Yes, Georgian case is interesting from a different perspective. A lot of discussion in Moscow about Caucasus, but it's very much centered on the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is understandable. It has changed a lot, the situation in the Caucasus. Turkey is now a much more important actor there, and Russia isn't quite happy about that. Discussions between Putin and Erdogan are continuing, but are kind of helpful for managing disagreements so far. We have seen how after the last meeting in Sochi, we had now the new escalation in Idlib, so tensions are not really resolved. Russia has a lot to scratch its head about the South Caucasus, but Georgia is nearly absent from these deliberations. The perception in Moscow is that Georgia is a complete mess. Its politics is entertaining in the sense that Saakashvili is back and he's arrested, and there is a lot of fuss about that, and that is about it. And the visit of US Defense Secretary has brought nothing new. And things are changing in Georgia. Step by step, Georgia is moving closer to Europe, closer to the West, closer to the United States, and I think it's moving closer to getting the membership action plan for joining NATO. It's not for the United States to be probably the main driver behind that. Quite possibly, the decisive voice will be coming from Ankara and Istanbul. I think Turkey has a role to play here. And Russia may be quite surprised with this shift in the South Caucasus, and I don't think it's ready for it, but I don't think it's in a position to stop or to respond forcefully. So my worries are much more about Ukraine, but I think things in Georgia are very much missed in Moscow. And I stop here. That's my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baev, for your first round speech and for keeping to the time limit. And now we turn to Mrs. Natasha Kurt, who is an international peace and security lecturer at King's College, London. Mrs. Kurt, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me today. in my 5 minutes, I'll try not to duplicate what other speakers have already said. And like Pavel and Andrey, I think I was a little bit surprised by the title. And I think maybe also the juxtaposition of grand strategy with Georgia and Ukraine. And, you know, grand strategy is, of course, a very fashionable term again these days. You know, is China's BRI a grand strategy? You know, we're kind of, it's really back in the lexicon of international relations. I think I'm not going to get into a definition of grand strategy, but I think the context obviously is always important. I mean, if we were to look at grand strategy in the Russian case, in terms of, you know, Russia's goals, you know, to what extent has it achieved whatever its goals were? You know, what starting point do we take for that? Do we take 1999? Do we take 2000? Do we take 2015? Do we take 2007 Munich? You know, where do we begin, if you like? And so, I mean, I think as a starting point, we can see that when Putin took over from Yeltsin, there were some key goals. I think certainly, if we leave aside Chechnya, for example, you know, the goal, I think, of kind of regaining Russian sort of, perhaps not hegemony, but Russian influence, certainly in the former Soviet space, the extent to which I think Russia in the 1990s had realized that it was really on the back foot, if you like. You look at Central Asia, you know, it was on the back foot, if you like, in relation to, or in comparison, I think, to perhaps the United States and even Europe in some respects, in terms of influence in the former Soviet space, but also clearly in terms of great power recognition. And I think when Obama called Russia a regional power, you know, that really hurt. And Russia has been working to rectify and to restore its place, I think, regionally, but also globally. Of course, Russia, you know, inherited the P5 seat of the Soviet Union. It was the continuator state of the Soviet Union, and that's really important to remember, because this already elevated Russia in a different way to the Soviet successor states. And I think ever since 1991, if you like, Russia has been trying to, in a way, say, look, we are a member of the P5, we have responsibility for international peace and security, we have a seat at the table of great powers, we are a great power, we're not just a regional power, but in some ways I think it needed to regain that regional power in order to concomitantly regain global power. And of course, military power, building up its military power, but from a very, very low base, went along with that, right? So in a way, you could say Russia now has the military that it needed, and it has enough military power to project, even perhaps project beyond its borders, as we saw in Syria. But I think, to me, really, although one could say that Russia has, to some extent, regained its role as a great power, it's regained recognition as a great power, I think that this is, you know, this is something that is difficult, increasingly difficult to hold on to. It's going to be increasingly difficult and costly to hold on to that, not least because of the rise of China, which we haven't mentioned. And I realize we're meant to be talking about Ukraine and Georgia, but I think that that Russia and China are able, to a certain extent, to sort of insulate each other, if you like, from certain pressure from the West. You know, if you like, Russia has its, it has support from China, both rhetorically, but also economically. And I think that this does help Russia in its quest to maintain influence. At the same time, of course, one can see that that Russia has to cede certain positions, if you like, to China in the Central Asian space. And I think if we then come to NATO and the EU, I'm actually put in mind of, I think, an article that Pavel wrote a couple of days ago in Jamestown Foundation, where I think he quite rightly pointed to the fact that the EU is actually becoming much more of a threat to Russia than NATO in many ways. NATO enlargement, I think, has already, I don't completely agree on Georgia, that whether Georgia will necessarily be given a map, because there is the problem of unresolved conflicts, and in theory, NATO would not want to import an unresolved conflict. On the other hand, talking of Turkey, we could point to Cyprus, of course, and say, well, they managed to overcome that in the case of EU membership. But I think that that for Russia, the EU, as very much a kind of normative actor, is more threatening to it in some ways than NATO. And the EU, as Pavel said, is very much present in Georgia, in Ukraine. It's possible. I think it's much more difficult to envisage Ukraine joining the EU for all sorts of reasons. Going forward, I think the West has been very slow to act collectively. We've seen with Biden, this problem of transatlantic unity. I think that's going to persist, and that's going to make it certainly easier for Russia to exploit those divisions. On the other hand, I don't think that Russia is all powerful. I don't think Russia has this kind of omnipotent power, if you like, that we often assign to it. And I think that the kind of internal problems which have been highlighted by other speakers as well in Russia, although the regime is, of course, relatively solid, at the same time, I think economic problems, the pandemic with the rising cases and so on at the moment, those kinds of internal problems are going to be more and more difficult to get on top of, and they may limit the possibilities for Russia to, for example, deal with the conflict in Ukraine. It may at some point just have to abandon eastern Ukraine. I think it's already really, a thorn in its side, but it may just decide to completely isolate Ukraine, and I think it has the levers to do that at the moment. Going forward is more difficult to say, but I think creating this kind of asymmetric dependence on Russian energy for Europe is certainly what Russia is trying to do right now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Kurt, for your opening speech. And now we turn to our first discussant, Dmitry Suslov, who is the Deputy Director of the Center for Comprehensive European and International Studies. Mr. Suslov, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very privileged and honored to participate in this remarkable panel. And I'm particularly delighted to speak after Natasha Kurt, because I also agree and think that Russian grand strategy exists. Despite some problems in implementation, despite the increased importance of domestic constraints and considerations, still I think Russian grand strategy exists. And this strategy, in my understanding, is about strengthening Russian role as an independent global great power in the existing global trends, which are generally viewed as favorable vis-a-vis Russia. Of course, there are many challenges, but the majority of trends, the prevailing trends, are favorable for Russia. The Western hegemony is over. The world has become polycentric, and in an increasing number of countries, like Turkey, conduct increasingly independent foreign policies, right, and do not want to follow the lead of global great powers. China was mentioned. China is a huge advantage of Russian foreign policy, but even more so is the systemic competition between China and the United States. And the fact that the US and China are locked in their systemic competition, rivalry, and the fact that the United States regards China, not Russia, as their major adversary, rival, and competitor creates lots of opportunities for Russia and increases the value and importance of Russia in very many regions. There is an objective and growing demand on Russia in very many non-Western regions, such as the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, and so on and so forth. So what does it mean for Russia to be a great power? My definition is this. First, it's maintaining Russia-centrism in the former USSR. It's a very important component, yes. Secondly, it's participation in global decision-making on par and together with other global leaders, with other great powers, regional and global. Thrice, it's being present in very many overseas regions in the world, again, such as the Middle East and Africa. And last but not least, it's maintaining a balanced system of partnerships with other centers of power. And this translates into three major components of Russian foreign policy. And we need, for the purpose of clarity of our analysis, really divide Russian foreign policy into three components. First, the post-Soviet space, except for the Baltic states, right? Because Russia does not consider Baltic states any longer as post-Soviet. So first, maintenance of Russia's centrism in the former USSR, and I will come closer to that later. Secondly, it is strengthening of partnerships and strengthening a balanced systems of partnerships with the non-West, such as Russia is doing in the Middle East, where Russia already is the only non-regional power which has balanced systems of relations with all the major Middle Eastern players, including Turkey. And the third component is managing confrontation with the West. And from the Russian perspective, at least the predominant Russian perspective, eventually the United States and European Union will have to adjust their policy vis-a-vis Russia and also accept Russia as a legitimate global independent great power. So this confrontation will be overcome on the Russian terms. Why? Because of the prevailing global trends, which I briefly described previously. So post-Soviet space, what does it mean to maintain Russia's centrism in the post-Soviet space? I fully agree with Andrey Kortunov that it is not about Russian classical domination of that region. And indeed, Russia is indifferent towards the nature of domestic politics in countries. Russia is pretty much okay with having more democratic Armenia and Kyrgyzstan coexisting with more authoritarian Belarus or Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan. My understanding of Russia's centrism in the region is this, that instead of classical domination, Russia offers or asserts three major principles, so three major red lines, which the countries in this region have to follow. Red line number one, they should not join the other security and economic orders. Russia is okay if the countries in the regions do not participate in Russia-centric economic and security orders, Eurasian Economic Union and CSTO, like Azerbaijan and or Uzbekistan, but Russia is not okay if the countries in the region want to join the economic and security orders of the others, NATO, association with the European Union, or even membership in the European Union. Red line number two, post-Soviet countries should avoid being instruments of the anti-Russian policy of the other countries, right? And this is also how Russia regards Ukraine. Russia is viewing Ukraine as a pawn, as an instrument of the containment of Russia policy conducted by the others, by the United States and the West at large. And red line number three, countries in the region should not construct their identities against Russia and at the anti-Russian purpose, at the anti-Russian standing. You know, those countries who do not cross those red lines, they are very much okay, and Russia basically beyond those red lines allows full independence for those countries in terms of their foreign and security policies. But those countries who do violate those red lines, they of course pay the price, right? And these countries include Ukraine and Georgia, who violate all those red lines, Ukraine especially, and partially Moldova, which does not want to join NATO, but still conducts integration with the European Union. This is why Moldova has a territorial integrity problem, but still Russia does not recognize independence of Transnistria, right? Probably Russia would if Moldova also proclaims membership in NATO. So I know that I need to end, but allow me just to finish this analysis of the Russian policy towards those countries who do violate these red lines, Ukraine and Georgia. I mean, from the Russian perspective, these countries must not be successful, and Russia will not allow them to be successful in their current foreign policy orientation. Russia uses all the instruments available to impede their integration with the economic and security orders of the West, and the Russian endgame is to change their foreign policy orientation. The purpose of Russian policy vis-a-vis Ukraine, the purpose, not the instruments, the purpose, the logic, has not changed at all since the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, since the victory of the Euromaidan revolution, which is, you know, to roll back the situation, to destroy the status quo which emerged in Ukraine after the victory of the Euromaidan revolution, and to build some more balanced environment in Ukraine and make sure and compel Ukraine to conduct a more balanced foreign policy, to be a common neighborhood for Russia and the West, not just a neighborhood of the West, let alone a member of the Western institutions. And the Minsk agreements, fulfill this purpose. Now I will finish with this, with the question: is this Russian strategy? Can this Russian strategy be successful, provided the pro-Western consensus in Ukrainian political elites and anti-Russian consensus in Ukrainian political elite? And the answer is yes. Why? Because from the Russian perspective, foreign policy orientation of countries like Georgia and Ukraine is to a big extent a result of the encouragement of the West, right? Is a big result of the policy of the open door policy, which the West deliberately conducts. And Russia expects eventually the West to change this policy and to change its messages vis-a-vis countries like Ukraine and Georgia. Look, American policy vis-a-vis Ukraine is already changing.
Yes.
We'll
hopefully have
it's very important. I need 30 seconds. US policy vis-a-vis Ukraine is already changing, right? Biden administration is trying to stabilize the situation. It is not increasing the support of Ukraine because of China, because Biden administration is interested in stabilization of its relations with Russia. And from the Russian perspective, in the longer term prospect, US policy vis-a-vis Ukraine will continue to change in a more favorable way vis-a-vis Russia, right? The US support for Ukraine will decline over time when the United States understands that it cannot successfully contain China. You know, having even stabilized confrontation with Russia, it will need to improve relations with Russia. And as a result of the change of American policy and EU policy vis-a-vis Ukraine, Ukraine will also change in a pro-Russian way and will finally become the country in between, not integrated with Russia, but not integrated with the West either. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Suslov. Now we turn to our second discussant, Mr. Emil Ardaliani, the Director of Middle East Studies at GeoCase. The floor is yours, Mr. Ardaliani. We typically have 5 minutes for the first round of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, and I would like to thank all the speakers and all those who already commented on those great speeches which we heard. I agree with Mr. Baev that Georgia is absent in the greater discussions on whether it's Russia's grand strategy or generally East-West competition and some other great topics which we hear in foreign policy. I would like to stress several points on what Russia actually encounters in the South Caucasus generally. I would say that we see the growing reliance on military reliance on military component in Russia's foreign policy in the South Caucasus. And I would say that with the dispatch of of peacekeeping force into Nagorno-Karabakh, there is a certain shift towards losing a prestige in Russia's foreign policy and a component where it relies more heavily on troops, on military elements in formulating its foreign policy towards this region. And this actually has huge repercussions because eventually you see that to control the region more or less, maybe not fully as it was during the Russian Empire or Soviet Union, but still nevertheless control it or rather influence it in all the aspects, Russia now has to be more militaristic in its foreign policy, I would say. And if you see what we had during the past several decades, see military bases in Georgia's Abkhazia and Tskhin Valley region, and essential occupation of those territories, or military base in Armenia, and now we've got essentially a military base on Azerbaijani soil. And this, I would say, the lack of ability to persuade, to use its prestige in the South Caucasus, this actually will have huge repercussions for Russia, three South Caucasus countries' relations. And I think the cause behind this, of course, is that you can no longer essentially close off the region from external powers. And I think Turkey is instrumental in opening up the region, whether it's better relations with Armenia or essentially building up corridors to Azerbaijan, whether through Georgia or Armenia's southernmost region of Syunik. And all of those measures, some might disagree, but I believe that all those measures hit essentially at what was a power base of Russia's vision, essentially, towards the South Caucasus. A closed region, essentially reliant on north-south infrastructure. But now with Turkey and other powers, you see basically some other links emerging, whether it's infrastructure or even geopolitical links, I would say alliances such as between Turkey and Azerbaijan. And all of that actually bites at what Russia was accustomed to having in this region, nearly complete dominance. And an even bigger reason behind that is that if you look from the geographic perspective, you see that South Caucasus is actually more linked to geographically to the wider Middle East rather than to Russia. I mean, the barrier, the Caucasus Mountains still matter a lot. And what Russia managed to do in the early 19th century when it actually annexed huge parts of the South Caucasus, it basically closed off the region from Ottoman Empire and Persian Empire. And by that, it linked the South Caucasus to the north, to the Russian heartland. And we now see, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, but especially in the last several years, the opening up of this region and return of South Caucasus and Middle East links. And these two actually hits badly at Russia's influence. And my concluding remark will be that the best hope now for Russia to actually retain its position amid its worsening prestige, of course in Tbilisi, we know what attitude Georgian population has generally toward this Russian occupation of these two territories of Abkhazia and Tskhinvali region, and of course deteriorating prestige of Russia in Armenia among Armenia's political elites, and now actually in Azerbaijan too. So Russia, with this militarization, basically trying to stop these geopolitical processes of opening up the South Caucasus towards the larger Middle East, essentially undermines its prestige in Armenia too, and now in Azerbaijan. And I believe that if not the military component, Russian influence in the region will be even lesser and lesser, and and essentially that's the unfortunate thing, I would say, for those who essentially formulate the vision of how Russia should behave in South Caucasus. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Avdeliani. I now turn to, I understand that Ms. Mendel has to leave in a few minutes, so she won't be able to participate in the second round. So I leave the floor to Mrs. Mendel if she has last minute comments up to 3 minutes or so as the second round response to what has been spoken. Thank you very much for your participation.
I'm really grateful for participating in this panel, and it's very interesting to listen to all the facts and predictions from such respected experts on this space and on Russia agenda. I just wanted to add some small things about Dmitry, what Dmitry was saying. Thank you for repeating all these narratives that Russia actually created as its internal vocabulary to disinform its society and the world. But actually, I would say that resistance of other countries of the region to join the economic or security institutions like NATO from Russian side is actually some kind of meddling in internal policies, which Russia is very successful in. And then, this disinformation narrative about that Russia does not accept that the countries become an instrument of the West. It doesn't make any sense, absolutely, because every country here stands for its identity, and the construction of identity on anti-Russian agenda also is, some fairy tale or myth, just to scare people, to try to, to oppose the West. I mean, it's Kremlin has created a very successful internal vocabulary, and we all must know this and be aware of this fact. Answering the question, has ever that Russia will never allow any country in its neighborhood to become successful if they don't implement the agenda mentioned from the 3 principles. Has ever Russia allowed anyone to be successful? Russia failed by itself to build strong economy and institution and to share the prosperity among its population. And if it's not able to build in its own country, then definitely it's not going to share the prosperity around the world. That's actually what I wanted to add, and I'm really very grateful to participate in this position. I'm actually traveling right now in Caucasus and will be in Georgia soon, continuing our conversation. So I wish you a good discussion, and stay in touch if possible. Thank you for raising this important agenda.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mendel, for your participation. We also look forward to keep in touch with all our participants going forward. Thank you very much. So our next third and next discussant is Mr. Gregory Simmons, researcher at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Uppsala University. The floor is yours, Mr. Simmons, for up to 5 minutes, and I'll raise my hand at the 4th minute as usual.
Thank you. Well, it's been very illustrative to listen to the back and forth conversations on this. It's certainly some of the speakers in particular brought up this kind of, once again, this bogeyman from history, this kind of Nazi connotations. And this always reminds me of a quote from one of those figures in mid-20th century Europe: to accuse your opponent that of which you are guilty. And in many cases, this is exactly what is happening here. If we look like the case of European gas crisis or energy crisis, why is this an issue in the first place? It's an issue because of sanctions imposed by the West. And this is causing these problems, and especially if the US, which wants its energy consumed at a greater price than what Russia would offer. So a lot of these are home goals. If we look once more, yes, it is important to put this into wider perspective, Ukraine and Georgia, into these global trends, which most speakers have done thus far. So we look at what's happening in terms of this transformation of the global geopolitical structure and hegemony from a Western-centric US unipolar world towards a more non-Western centric multipolar world. And these things are having an impact. And when you have an empire in decline, these do not usually go quietly. And this is certainly indicative of some of the trends which are occurring now. And what the coronavirus has done is just to strengthen some of these failings and stresses in this system. So if we're looking at Ukraine, and for example, one of the points was, well, I mean, what's happening in Belarus? That there are a number of problems with this particular perspective, because if we look at it from another perspective, people in Belarus also know what happened in Ukraine. And from what I see and hear from many people there, that they do not want to follow the same path. They do not want to become a tributary state. So this is an incentive not to change. There are, of course, problems with the system, and many have gone through them. But the point is, there is always a possibility to go from bad to worse. And when we're looking at the approaches of the different parties within this foreign policy and in particular public diplomacy, there are different approaches by actors. I mean, there have been these comments that Turkey and Azerbaijan have been opening up post-Soviet space, but this has been opened up since the Soviet collapse. There have been other countries there, namely United States, to a lesser extent the EU, Iran, other countries included. So, I mean, this has been a case. The thinking that what has happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, and I've heard this from different Azeri colleagues that I work with, that this will limit Russia's ability to interact in the South Caucasus, I think is a misnomer. If anything, it gives them a better position in there, because the problem with this is you're ignoring history. Not everyone views history in the same way. And the big elephant in the room, I mean, can there be any reproach between Armenia and Turkey, which was involved with Azerbaijan? So you bring in not only what is contemporarily mixing, but also historically. And this kind of approach of this Western liberalism, this messianic path to convert others to be more like them is now being replaced by these non-Western actors that take a much more pragmatic approach for national interests and objectives. So instead of going and trying to convert other people, they try to create relationships, whether it is commercial, whether it is cultural, or other means. But this are some of the changes which are happening. And this is all occurring within a very volatile system. So I will just finish there so I don't take other people's time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simmons, for your comments. And now we turn to Ms. Iuliia Nikitina, who is an associate professor of world politics and research fellow at the Center for the Post-Soviet Studies at MGIMO. The floor is yours, Ms. Nikitina.
Thank you very much. I would like to join the chorus of those who are not so happy with the title or with the questions asked to the panelists, because it gives me an impression that generally Turkey wants to be closer to Ukraine and to Georgia than to Russia, because in the formulation of the questions, twice it is repeated that Russia has aggressive policy, Russia has aggressive plans, and so on. So the formulations themselves show that Turkey, from the perspective of Russia, might position itself as a regional leader in Eurasian generally. Then my second point, the lessons that Russian policymakers drew from Georgian and Ukrainian cases are as follows. So in case of Shevardnadze and the Rose Revolution, Shevardnadze was quite a pro-Western leader. So Russian political elites concluded from the revolution that actually, even if the elites of the country are quite pro-Western, there can be no promises from the West that the relations will be stable and there will be no revolution. The conclusion drawn by Russian political elites from the case of Ukraine are based on the case of Yanukovych and the agreement signed on the 21st of February 2014. That even if you sign the agreement with the West, even if the West moderates it, still there are no guarantees. And thus we have the conclusions made by our elites and the actions that we all witness. The next point on NATO-Russia relations in general is the elephant in the room again. So NATO positions itself as a political organization, but we should know that generally speaking, democratic countries which are members of NATO, they do not fight each other, but they may start conflicts against non-democratic states. So Russia perceives itself as a democracy, but since NATO countries do not see Russia as a democratic state, there is always well, a chance that NATO will start a conflict, military conflict against Russia. So thus Russian political elites are also aware of that and they make their conclusions. Then the next idea on mutual perceptions. Indeed, I agree with Greg here that we see very well those mutual mirror perceptions, and in conflict studies that's described really well. So we have to have it in mind when we listen to all those discourses. And a couple of words on the articles by Putin and Medvedev on Ukraine, because it was raised. Generally, I would say that the Russian approach or kind of grand strategy is to conclude elite level deals. And Russia does not really want any mediation from the West. And Putin's article, as I read it, of course, the Ukrainian interpretation is really different, but the intention was to show that an elite level deal between Russia and Ukraine is possible without the Western mediation, because the West encourages too much Ukraine and there are no guarantees that the West will not abandon Ukraine at some point. Medvedev's article seems to say the opposite, that elite level deals cannot be concluded. So that's why generally the comments in Russian media are that the audience and the target of Medvedev's article was domestic, that he wanted to show something to the members of the political elite, or that was the disappointing, saying that, okay, we don't want the Western mediation, we want a deal with political elites of Ukraine, but it seems that it's not possible at this stage. And finally, the idea is that, I'm coming back to this idea of mirror perceptions, that the West is waiting for 2024 in Russia, that's in 2024 or 2030, Putin will leave and then all the problems will be settled. So that's what Medvedev's article seems to signal as well. Let's wait and see until elites will change. And this is not the best strategy for neither of the actors, wait and see. So we as experts should try to find some solutions at this current stage and not wait and see as policymakers suggest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nikitina. And now we turn to our final discussant before the second round of responses. And our final discussant in this first round is Mr. Mohammed Koçak, who is a research fellow at the Florida International University. The floor is yours for up to 5 minutes, Mr. Koçak.
Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for this. I try to be within the topic and try not to replicate what others already said. So the topic is basically the Russia's grand strategy, especially towards Ukraine and Georgia. As Dmitry Suslov very explained in detail, Russia's grand strategy obviously is well documented in their national strategy documents and military strategy documents. I generally keep it very simple. I think Russia's grand strategy lays upon two main mini or sub-strategies, or sub-goals, which are countering the West or opposing Western hegemonic influence globally, and also increasing Russia's hegemonic influence in what is called the near abroad. So Ukraine and Georgia is very significant for both of these goals because it lays between Russia and the West, and both countries are also within the post-Soviet region, which Russia calls it near abroad. So as of current, there is at least within the past couple of decades, there has been a trend of escalation because of the expansion of the West through some advancements of the membership processes of these countries to Western institutions, and Russia's what we can call territorial gains through either some segments of the minorities or by supporting political actors that are close to Russia. So moving forward, I think even though there is a balance here, I think moving forward, we can talk about the dynamics that whether Russia or the West will gain within the next decade or so is hints upon various dynamics, which are, I think, first, the world political dynamics, regional dynamics, Russia's own domestic dynamics. I think the current contours of the world order are pretty enabling for Russia because of the rise of China and the retrenchment in the US foreign policy, which began with Obama, gained some pace under Trump and continues under Biden. I think that the United States deprioritized its conflict with Russia and more like focusing on China right now, which is advantageous for Russia and gives a significant advantage for Russia for realizing its goals. The regional dynamics, I think we can call the region where Ukraine and Georgia is included as the Black Sea region. And at this particular place, I think beyond Russia, there are some actors that are also influential, and there we can talk about Turkey, because Turkey shares with the Black Sea the longest border, and it is, you know, it has some sort of a sea border with Ukraine and has a land border with Georgia, and it has good relations with both of these countries, and it has good relations with Russia as well. And incidentally, the current world order, which is enabling those countries which are trying to play a more middle powers, which are trying to play a more independent and assertive role in the current global order, the retrenchment in the US foreign policy is providing an advantage to Turkey along with Russia. So, and also talking about Russia's domestic, I mean, what's going on in Russia obviously also affects factors in what's going on in Russia's Ukraine and Georgia policy. And here, I think we can talk about three important dynamics, which are the rising gas prices, as you all should follow. They are, you know, really, I think it has quadrupled, and this kind of development will come back and help Russia kind of fund their foreign policy enterprises. However, the inflation and Russia's current economic hardships and its hardships in battling COVID are preventing Russia from realizing its foreign policy goals. So moving forward, what to expect? I expect increasing role for regional actors, especially for Turkey, who can have a new round of rapprochement with Ukraine and Georgia, probably in tandem with Russia or in consultation with Russia, not in conflict with Russia. Possible Western institutional advance towards the region, as we can see from U.S. Secretary for Defense Lloyd Austin's visits to Ukraine and Georgia, and corresponding Russian reaction. However, I think that there will be a balance between these two, and I do not expect any new rounds of conflict, because I think that neither Russia nor the United States or the EU will accept such development. Thank you very much for giving the word for me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kochak, for your comments. And this basically brought the first round to an end. I just got a 10-minute extension from the backstage, so that will give 2, but up to 3 minutes to each participant to respond. And I'll use 60 seconds drawing on your comments, because this grand strategy debate is continuing in Turkey as well. We just published a special issue of perceptions on Turkey's grand strategy and where it should be headed. And it has a very similar question to what many commentators have expressed. Is the United States abandoning the Middle East and the near the Caucasus and the Black Sea region, right? If the United States is abandoning these regions, Russia's neighborhood, Caucasus, and the Black Sea basin in favor of surrounding China, it has a completely different repercussions for what, you know, Turkey, Russia, Israel, Iran, and many other regional actors will probably have to do. And the second question that also comes from your comments, multiple actually speakers and discussants' comments, is that in the hypothetical scenario of a change in the status quo in South Ossetia and Abkhazia, or even in Transnistria, what is going to happen? I mean, if Georgia does indeed accede to either a membership action plan or, as Pavel Baev has suggested, long-term EU membership, and Russia, and I'm being blunt here, as Ms. Mendel, for example, invited us to be, and we suddenly hear of a vote in South Ossetia and Abkhazia to unite with the Russian Federation. What is the next step? I mean, is there any military, economic, or political break to prevent such a scenario from happening, because we have seen it? And my final, I used only 2 minutes. My comment already in 2008-2014 was that after seeing what has happened in Georgia and in Ukraine, and to the Free Syrian Army and the Syrian opposition, the actors in the Middle East and the post-Soviet space will be extremely hesitant to trust any American and Western assurances because of what has happened to the Syrian opposition and to the Saakashvili government and to the Ukrainian government after 2013-2014. So with these three provocations, which took 2 minutes and 20 seconds, I return to the second round of questions and comments from all the speakers and discussants. We are, of course, missing one, but Ms. Mendel already spoke before she left. So if you follow the same order, let's do that. Start with Mr. Kortunov. You have up to 2-3 minutes, and I'll raise my hand.
Thank you. I'd like to get back to the issue of Russia as a great power. What does make Russia great in the international system? Russia has a limited tool of foreign policy instruments, but it can use them rather efficiently. It is a nuclear superpower, so Biden has to talk to Putin if he wants to avoid an uncontrolled arms race, which is not in the US interest. Russia has military power outreach capabilities, which were demonstrated in Syria. Arguably, Russia was more successful in Syria than the United States in Afghanistan. And definitely it's a major foreign policy asset. Russia has a role to play in international energy markets, but also in the international markets of military hardware, in the global food markets, and in a number of other dimensions of the international economic system. And finally, Russia has a privileged position in the United Nations Security Council as a permanent member, and it is also one of the leading players in large regional and trans-regional groupings like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, like the BRICS group of nations. It's a part of G20. So these are the assets. And as I said, Russia uses them in a rather efficient way. But the question is whether these assets can remain as efficient as they are right now in years to come. And I think here is the greatest challenge for the Russian Federation. What it has to do is to diversify its foreign policy instruments kit. It has to invest much more heavily in soft power, in economic power, in becoming a real player in the international financial and ecological systems. If it doesn't do that, I think it would be very difficult to maintain the same level of influence and presence in the international system in years to come. If it does diversify its foreign policy instruments, it might have new opportunities even in countries like South Caucasus and Ukraine, though it will not come anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kortunov. Now we turn to Mr. Baev.
Thank you. One point I want to make is how in Russia, in the Russian discourse on international affairs, the idea of the declining West, of the splits in the West, of the kind of shift in the international system and multipolarity is interpreted as benefiting Russia. You know, I grew up with that discourse 40 years ago. We know how it ended. It's rather amusing to see how Russia is ignoring the plain fact how this ongoing transformation of international system is generally working against Russia. How much Russia's decline has accelerated during that particular crisis caused by the COVID epidemics. This blindness, this absolute refusal to see its own position in the world system is really amazing. And what is one particular element in this is definitely the military overstretch. Russia generally relies on the military force as the instrument of policy, as an instrument of choice in foreign policy. Yes, there's no secret about that. But Russia has really overcommitted. And its desire to play with the military force everywhere, from Arctic to Syria, from Belarus to the Far East, is now really coming to a situation where, yes, there is a new massive security challenge coming from Afghanistan, and Russia cannot deploy their sufficient military force in order to bring assets there. Russia needs to disinvest somewhere else. And I think that impact is underestimated. The kind of Russia's inability to rely on its own military strengths, I think, will have serious consequences. And it might bring Russia to a crisis to which it's unprepared. And I'm worried in this regard, particularly about developments in Ukraine. But I think we also need to have a word about Georgia. Yes, definitely the NATO membership action plan is always a big question mark, and certainly Georgia's territorial integrity is seriously compromised, but it is a different situation with this now than it was in the year 2008. Back then, yes, there were 2 secessions in Georgia. Georgia was the only country in the world suffering from 2 secessions, which were essentially a post-Soviet phenomenon. Now it is not a post-Soviet phenomenon. Now these 2 secessions are treated the same way as, I don't know, Donetsk Republic. That's the context of the secessions, and that's why the attitude is very different, and that's why I think the NATO membership action plan is a possibility here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Baev. Now we turn to Ms. Natasha Kurt for her comments.
Thank you. I mean, I think it's interesting what Pavel was saying about Russia risking overstretch and so on. I mean, and as I said before, I think there is a danger in seeing Russia perhaps as being able to do a lot more, than it actually really has the potential to do. It doesn't necessarily, it can't be everywhere at once, although sometimes it seems as if it can. It's sort of moving into Africa. It's, people are talking about Russia filling the vacuum in Afghanistan and so on. But actually, in terms of Africa, for example, these are kind of niche areas of security that Russia can provide, or weapons, military hardware, and so on. But I think we can look back to the Soviet period and say, did Russia actually achieve any influence in those African countries in the Soviet period? It certainly didn't gain any loyalty from many of those countries simply by selling their military hardware, for example. But of course, Russia can make mischief, if you like, and that's not really necessarily grand strategy, but it can cause problems for others by its actions. I just wanted to quickly say something about this point about the fact that the US is deprioritizing conflict with Russia, which will be beneficial for Russia in some sense of achieving its goals. I think to some extent that can be true, but in another way, I think also Russia really fears that the US will deprioritize relations with Russia, and that it will prioritize relations with China, and that Russia will therefore then no longer be, if you like, the significant other of the United States, which in many ways is Russia's claim to great power status, for that bilateral kind of relationship to continue.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kurt, for your comments. And now we turn to Greg Simmons, who has to leave, and then we'll continue the order as it was, because we have another 10-12 minutes.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, listening to this, I kind of get cognitive dissonance, because I mean, what I hear, Russia is overcommitted, Russia is doing this. I mean, if we replace Russia with the United States, this is one of the primary reasons for the US losing its power, its influence globally, not only here in the region we're talking about. And what we have now is relations are changing and how the US relates to the world, including Russia. This is not about expanding US influence in the area. It's about obstructive foreign policy that is preventing the rise of other powers in order to keep their relative advantage over the others, because they have failed utterly in adhering to Brzezinski's 3 strategic imperatives, which were created in the chessboard. So the US is it's not trying to manage its decline, but rather prevent the rise of other powers in order to keep its relative advantage over the others. But even in this, it is failing. So I will leave it there with these provocative comments. I have to go, unfortunately. I would have liked to stay, but thank you for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Mr. Simmons. Thank you very much for your comments. And now we turn to Mr. Dmitry Suslov for his second round comments.
Thank you very much. Again, excellent discussion, and it's so amusing to hear about the perils of multipolarity, which is just emerging. 40 years ago, we did not have it. We had a transition from bipolarity to unipolarity, which ultimately failed. And only now we have the emergence of a polycentric world. And it's also amusing to listen about Russian overstretch, especially military stretch, in conditions when Russia is the only P5 country which is reducing its defense budget. Of course, I mean, without question, multipolarity and the fact that Russia is not a superpower, unlike China and unlike the United States, is one of the major assets and advantages of Russian foreign policy and the sources of Russian attractions precisely in the region like Africa. Natasha talked about the limits of Russian influence in Africa. Well, I said before, Russia is not going to become a hegemon in Africa, but in terms of the state of relations, just look at the previous Russia-Africa summit, which brought all 54 African countries to Sochi. Pay attention to the next Russia-Africa summit. Look into how many African countries joined anti-Russian sanctions and how do African summits, how do African countries vote in the UN General Assembly on the anti-Russian resolutions, which criticize Russia. And you will see enormous loyalty and sympathy towards Russia in the region. So one of the major assets of Russian foreign policy, in addition to what Andrey Kortunov enumerated, is basically historical trends, right? The prevailing historical trends, which are viewed as generally favorable vis-a-vis Russia, which allow Russia, to multiply, to exert its influence and promote its interests, doing it not in a costly way. And I strongly disagree that the Russian military presence in the Middle East or Africa is costly. It is not. If it had been costly, Russia would not have done it because of the internal factors, because of the internal pressure. And the Kremlin even sells it to the public opinion as a not costly policy. And I want to very quickly also to comment on this combination of Medvedev article and Putin article on Ukraine, which I find very complementary, not contradictory to each other. Now, it is not a coincidence that Medvedev's article was published at the day when Victoria Nuland arrived in Moscow in order to discuss Ukraine. And the message of that article is that Russia is looking forward to a discourse with the United States on Ukraine, right? We are observing already a substantial change of American foreign policy, as a reluctance on the part of the Biden administration to allow further escalation in Ukraine, to keep the status quo. And we are ready to conduct the conversation with the United States, right? Not with Ukraine. Dialogue with Ukraine itself is regarded as senseless right? And there was a very straightforward message that we want to talk to the masters, not to the pawns, not to the instruments that the masters use in their policy. Putin's article, Putin's article is, yes, we are ready to talk to Ukraine, but with a different political elite in Ukraine. And the message is, I'm saying the last sentence, that as soon as the West changes its policy vis-a-vis Ukraine, the objective factors which Putin described, interdependence, intersocietal connections, and all the rest, will do their job. Right, and without the Western encouragement, without the Western support, Ukraine will change in a normal way. The current pro-Western elites will go to the dustbin of history because they exist only as a result of the Western support and Western policy, right? So the change of the Western policy will, normalize actually the relations between Russia and Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Suslov. And now we turn to Mr. Ardeliani for his second round comments.
Thank you. I would like to touch upon this idea of great shifts in the world politics. I mean, the balance of power essentially, and shift of economic and political power from the West to the East. And the discussion which we had here so far seems to be moving into the direction of the West essentially losing the power and influence at the expense of other Eurasian, I would say, or at the expense of Eurasian forces. But I would say that of course, there are problems in the liberal world order, but we should also emphasize how elastic the idea in itself is, and how throughout the essentially centuries, especially during the 20th century, how elasticity of this idea actually helped it to prevail over several major crises. But I also look at the present shifts in the global balance of power as a diffusion of power, actually, but not as a certain decline of the West. Diffusion of power among many actors, and I think that this idea of a definite decline of one power at the expense of another is rather it's not a complete, I would say, misunderstanding, but it's over. Well, it's certainly exaggeration of the present processes, and I think the term diffusion, for the moment at least, better explains the processes which we witness nowadays.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ardeliani, for your comments. And now we turn to Ms. Nikitina for her second round comments.
Thank you. I will try to answer your question on South Ossetia, Abkhazia, and will also mention Donbass. So as it seems to me, Russian strategy regarding those groups of cases is as follows, that Russia is ready to integrate people, but not territories. Russia doesn't want to recognize Donbass as an independent entity. Russia doesn't want to include it into Russia. As to South Ossetia and Abkhazia, of course, we know all those military treaties signed and so on, and Georgia believes that Russia is there and occupies those territories, but generally speaking, Russia could have included South Ossetia and Abkhazia into itself in 2008, but Russia never did it. So regarding those three cases, we can say that it's more about people rather than territories, probably for different reasons. But when it comes to Ukraine, regarding Donbass, I would say that Ukraine is ready to integrate the territory of Donbass, but not people who are fleeing to Russia mostly, and Ukraine is not ready to integrate people who are not absolutely pro-Ukrainian. And there was a law document on transitional periods in Donbass and so on with those ideas. So I don't see any immediate way out of this, unfortunately. But when it comes to Georgia, Georgia is ready to integrate people with those neutral documents and so on. So I think that Georgian and Ukrainian strategies here are different. And to me, Georgia currently conducts a more successful strategy of reintegration of those breakaway territories. Well, probably I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nikitina, for your comments. And finally, we have Mr. Kochak for his second round comments.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you very much for turning back to me. So I think I will have to join and agree with Simmons, Kuhl, and Suslov on disagreeing with Pavel Baev, who argued that Russia is overstretching. I'm sorry about this, but I think that Russia doesn't need to invest. I mean, Russia's foreign policy isn't costly a lot because it's playing a weak hand against the West. It doesn't really want to be the sole hegemon on world politics. It doesn't want to be the unipole. It just doesn't want the West to establish a hegemony over the globe that we live on, and it also opposes the West from stretching to what it describes as the near abroad. So by playing the weak hand, it does many sorts of things. For example, under Soviet periods, the Soviet Union has to provide some developmental assistance to those countries with providing factories of heavy machinery and stuff. But today, Russia doesn't have to do that. It just supports mercenaries, supports certain political actors, and just by shaking things up a little bit, as it does in Libya, in Africa, in Europe, and even in the United States itself, it can, quote unquote, win by not investing much. So I think this will continue over, at a global level, but on regional level, where Russia wants to establish dominance over the post-Soviet space, I think over there, West has some advantage, even though it is retrenching a little bit since at least the mid or late 2000s. There, I think, especially in Ukraine and Georgia, the countries that we discussed, Russia is struggling to maintain absolute hegemony over, or making those countries follow its or acting in a way that would conform to its own national interests, because those are also independent countries taking their own independent decisions. So it goes both ways. I mean, this multipolarity, yes, it's absolutely beneficial for Russia when we talk about Western global hegemony, what Russia calls it, but it doesn't work so well for Russia in Ukraine and Georgia. That's my last comment. And thank you very much for all the participants.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Kochak. So this gives me the opportunity, as we conclude our 2 rounds of discussion, to thank all the participants who are present and those who have left for your participation. This is a conversation that has begun and is ongoing about Russian grant strategy, Turkish grant strategy, American grant strategy, of course, that many participants alluded to, as well as the Chinese grant strategy being the theme of this year's TRT World Forum. And as I mentioned, it's a conversation that began, but is in no way ended, and is likely to continue for many years, if not decades, in academic journals and popular media and elsewhere. And we are very grateful to hear from these diverse perspectives in this forum, and we want to keep in touch and continue the conversation going forward. Thank you very much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.